Margaret Hayes had worked as a housekeeper for 37 years. Her hands had scrubbed countless floors, polished endless silverware, and folded more linens than she could count. But she had never seen anything quite like the mansion. On Riverside Drive, where she'd just been hired. At 62, Margaret thought she'd seen it all. She'd worked in grand homes before, but this place was different. The ceiling seemed to reach toward heaven itself, and the chandeliers sparkled like frozen waterfalls. Every room held treasures that spoke of wealth beyond her imagining. Mr. Jonathan Pierce, the master of the house, was a man in his early 40s. Tall and distinguished, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from old money. He was polite enough, though distant, as wealthy men often were. Margaret didn't mind. She preferred to do her work without fuss. On her third day, Mr. Pierce asked her to dust the upstairs hallway. It was a long corridor lined with portraits and paintings in ornate frames. Margaret moved slowly, carefully wiping each frame with her soft cloth. She hummed an old hymn as she worked, the way she'd done for decades. Then she came to a portrait that made her stop breathing. It was a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with sandy brown hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore a navy sweater over a crisp white shirt. His expression was gentle, almost wistful. But it wasn't the painting itself that shocked Margaret. It was the face. She knew that face. Margaret's cloth fell from her trembling hands. Her knees went weak, and she had to steady herself against the wall. 35 years melted away in an instant, and she was back at St. Catherine's orphanage, where she'd worked as a young woman before becoming a housekeeper. "Sir," she called out, her voice cracking. "Mr. Pierce!" Jonathan appeared at the top of the stairs, concern crossing his features. "Mrs. Hayes? What's wrong?" Margaret pointed at the portrait with a shaking finger. Tears were already streaming down her face. This boy. He lived with me at the orphanage." Jonathan's expression changed completely. The distant politeness vanished, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes fixed on the portrait. "You knew him?" His voice was barely a whisper. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with her apron. "His name was Timothy. Little Timothy Morrison. He came to St. Catherine's when he was just 5 years old. I worked there. From 1963 to 1971. Such a sweet child. He was, so gentle and kind." Jonathan stared at the portrait for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "That's my son, Michael. He passed away 6 years ago." The words hung in the air between them like a prayer. Margaret's heart broke all over again. "Oh, Mr. Pierce, I'm so terribly sorry." They stood together in that hallway, two people brought together by an impossible coincidence, or perhaps by something more deliberate, something beyond understanding. "Would you?" Jonathan began, then paused. "Would you like to sit down? I'd very much like to hear about Timothy. If you don't mind talking about it?" Margaret nodded. They went downstairs to the kitchen, where she made tea the way she always did when life became overwhelming. The familiar ritual steadied her hands. As they sat at the kitchen table, Margaret began to remember. "Timothy came to us in the autumn. His mother had died, and there was no other family. Those were different times. There was less help for children in need. St. Catherine's did its best. But we had so many little ones and never enough hands." She paused, remembering. Timothy was special, though. Not because he was different from the others, but because he was so very kind. When new children arrived, frightened and alone, Timothy would sit with them. He'd share his toys even though he had so few. He'd hold their hands during thunderstorms. Jonathan listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. "There was a girl," Margaret continued. "Little Sarah Chen. She'd come from a difficult situation and wouldn't speak to anyone. Day after day, she just sat in the corner, silent as stone. But Timothy would sit beside her every afternoon. He wouldn't force conversation. He'd just be there, sometimes reading picture books aloud, sometimes just sitting quietly. After 2 months, Sarah finally smiled. A week later, she spoke her first words. "And do you know what she said?" Jonathan shook his head. "She said, 'Thank you, Timothy.' That was the kind of boy he was." A tear rolled down Jonathan's cheek. He didn't try to hide it. "My son was like that, too." Michael had a gentleness about him. He noticed people who were hurting. At school, he befriended the lonely children. He'd invite them to sit with him at lunch. They talked for hours that afternoon, Margaret shared memories of Timothy's years at the orphanage. How he loved to draw pictures of houses with big families inside. How he'd help the smaller children tie their shoes. How he'd always say please and thank you, even when the older boys teased him for being too polite. Jonathan, in turn, told her about Michael. How he'd grown into a thoughtful young man. How he'd volunteered at a children's hospital every Saturday. How he'd planned to become a teacher, because he wanted to help children who struggled, the way he once had. What happened to Timothy? Jonathan finally asked. After the orphanage? Margaret's expression brightened. Oh, he found his blessing. A wonderful couple, the Harrisons, adopted him when he was 9. They were older folks who couldn't have children of their own. They gave Timothy everything. Love, education, opportunity. Last I heard, many years ago now, he'd become a doctor. A pediatrician working with children. Jonathan smiled through his tears. Of course he did. And Michael? Margaret asked gently. Jonathan's voice was steady, though sad. Leukemia. He fought for 2 years. He never complained, not once. Even in the hospital, he worried about the other children in the cancer ward. He made friendship bracelets for them, wrote them encouraging notes. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 souls sharing grief and memory. May I ask something? Margaret said. Why does the portrait look so much like Timothy? The resemblance is extraordinary. Jonathan smiled softly. I've been thinking about that all afternoon. Michael looked like my late wife, Catherine. She passed when Michael was just 3. But you're right. There's something in his expression in that portrait. A kindness that transcends features. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Jonathan formed an unexpected friendship. She was no longer just the housekeeper. They'd have tea together in the afternoons, sharing stories and finding comfort in each other's company. Margaret brought photo albums from her years at St. Catherine's. There, in faded black and white photographs, was young Timothy, playing with other children, helping set tables, smiling his gentle smile. Jonathan looked at those photos for hours. It's like looking at Michael in another time, he said. Not just the physical resemblance, but something deeper, a spirit of kindness. One afternoon, Margaret made a suggestion. Mr. Pierce, have you ever thought about continuing Michael's work? The volunteering he did? Jonathan looked thoughtful. I've tried. After he died, I threw myself into my business. It was easier than facing the grief. But you're right. Michael would want his kindness to continue. Together, they created the Michael Pierce Foundation, dedicated to supporting children in foster care and orphanages. Jonathan provided the resources, and Margaret, with her years of experience, helped design the programs. They set up scholarship funds for children aging out of foster care. They created mentorship programs, connecting successful adults with kids who needed guidance. They funded art and music programs for orphanages, remembering how Timothy had loved to draw. On the first anniversary of the foundation, they stood together at St. Catherine's, the same orphanage where Margaret had worked decades ago. It had been renovated with foundation funds. Children laughed and played in new playground equipment. Do you think they knew each other? Margaret asked quietly. Timothy and Michael? Maybe in some way we can't understand? Jonathan considered this. My wife Catherine used to say that kindness ripples outward like waves on water. Maybe Timothy's kindness all those years, ego created ripples that reached Michael. And maybe Michael's kindness will reach other children who'll pass it on. Margaret nodded. That's a beautiful thought. As the sun set over St. Catherine's, casting golden light across the playground, they watched the children play. Each child was someone's Timothy, someone's Michael, a vessel of potential kindness, waiting to change the world in small, profound ways. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes, Jonathan said, for seeing that portrait, for sharing those memories, for helping me find purpose again. Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. Some things are meant to be, Mr. Pierce. I truly believe that. I was meant to see that portrait. We were meant to meet, and together we're meant to help these children. They stood together as the evening deepened. 2 people connected by loss, memory, and the enduring power of kindness. In the portrait hall at home, young Michael looked out with his gentle eyes, and somewhere in memory, Timothy Morrison smiled back. The kindness hadn't ended. It had simply found new hands to continue its work, spreading ripples of hope across generations.